You're listening to a 58 Ember production.
How many ways can Star Wars redefine media? One way was through the Star Wars radio dramas that helped save National Public Radio and expanded the universe. In this episode, we detail the importance of this sister project to the films and highlight the significance of writer Brian Daley.
Welcome to Skytalkers. Here are your hosts, Charlotte and Caitlin.
Hello, and welcome to Skytalkers. I'm your host, Charlotte.
Hey everyone, I'm your other host, Caitlin, and welcome to this week's episode where we're talking all about the importance of the Star Wars radio dramas, which is going to be really fun. Charlotte is actually kind of spearheading this episode, and I'm really excited to talk about these radio dramas.
Yeah, I don't even know what to say. I'm like really excited, and it's a new hyperfixation, and I hope that if you're listening, it will be your new hyperfixation too if you're unaware of the Star Wars radio dramas.
Yeah, me too. I feel like I've learned a lot about them in the past like 24 hours, and I know there's a book that came out very recently called The Star Wars Radio Dramas, Brian Daley and the Serialization That Saved NPR by Maria Jose Tenuto and John Tenuto. And Blast Points did an interview with them a couple of years ago. The book recently came out, and that is all what kind of inspired this discussion, which I think is going to be really fun.
Yeah, the book coming out, I was like, okay, it's time for us to get into it. I've heard about them for years.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure I had listened to them years ago, but they didn't take hold on me in the same way that it does now, and the history really grounds it for me. So anyway, we're going to put a pin in that because we have some housekeeping.
Yeah, we have a little bit of housekeeping here at the top. I think first and foremost, we have to touch on the fact that news came out last week that sadly the Acolyte was canceled for a second season, which is honestly just a huge bummer. I know Charlotte and I are both very disappointed and frustrated with this decision. It just frankly doesn't feel right and is super disappointing. I know so many people in the community were so in love with this show. It brought in a lot of new fans that I saw. I mean, anecdotally, it brought in a lot of new fans, and I just have such great respect we both do, for the cast and crew that it's really disappointing, honestly. And I really hope that something can change, and I don't know, miracles will happen and a season 2 will come. But the show was just incredible. And we both had if you listen to our discussions, you know, we were absolutely over the moon with the Acolyte. So it was a hard news to receive. And we are actually going to have a Patreon episode where we're going to talk about it a little bit more, what the response has been, some of the news that has come out about the cancellation and things like that. So you can head on over to our Patreon to check out that if you're interested.
Yeah, I think it's been a hard week and a half as a Star Wars fan. Existing online as an Acolyte enjoyer has been really tough. The abuse that I've seen thrown at the actors and crew just this past week has just been terrible. And I think it's just feels like a really hard and embarrassing time to be a Star Wars fan. It's just hard. So I feel like we had to talk about it on the show. It brings me no joy to talk about it, right? I don't want to. And I really hope something can change. I really, really, really hope something can change. And maybe I'll be able to edit this out if something does change, but it's just been a tough couple days, I think, in the Star Wars fandom.
Yeah, it has not been fun. There actually is a petition going around right now about renewing the Acolyte. You and I have both signed it. It's got, at the time of recording, over 37,000 signatures, and that's really just from like Twitter. So if you're interested and want to show your support, definitely go and leave positive comments on all of the cast and crew's Instagram and go and sign the petition, because who knows? Something could happen from that. And like Charlotte said, it does feel really embarrassing and not fun. And we really love this show and are so grateful to the people that made it and to have been a part of kind of celebrating the great work that they did. So,
and we'll be continuing to do that too.
Right.
Just
exactly.
an FYI. Just because this is the seemingly the end of the Acolyte as we know it. That doesn't mean that it's not the end of the fan conversation around it,
Mhm.
for at least for Caitlin and I. So
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. We certainly didn't want to start off the show on a bummer, but that's been a huge thing the past week and a half. And the reason you didn't hear us talk about it last week when the news actually came out is that episode of Clone Wars was already pre-recorded. So it was already done and kind of in the can. So that's why we didn't
Yeah.
address it on that one. But I think it would be, remiss to say that we're doing this huge Clone Wars discussion about a show that had so much time to grow and find an audience over a lot of years. And man, I wish that we could get that with the Acolyte at some
Yeah,
point as well.
it's freaking fascinating. Even in our
Yeah.
rewatch series, going back and like when I was editing it before it aired last Thursday, and it was the news of the Acolyte's cancellation was really fresh.
Hmm.
Listening back to us talk about the early comments on some of those first episodes of the Clone Wars, I was like, I can't believe the timing, the fact that this vitriol that comes with any new project, it's just so consistent in the Star Wars fandom that things need time to grow and change and to grow an audience and a fan base. That there's so many things that can be true at the same time, right? Like that sort of vitriol is so annoying and frustrating and terrible that comes out from every single new Star Wars project. But it just feels in the fact that it feels like a weird rite of passage. I don't know. I can't even wrap my head around it. It's just, to me, it was weird listening to the Clone Wars beginnings while the Acolyte's beginnings were reflective of the Clone Wars beginnings. And the Clone Wars had 7 seasons and a late renewal also later to flesh out their story and to become one of the most beloved Star Wars projects of all time. And the Acolyte had 8 episodes and was canceled within
Like a
less
month.
than a month
Yeah.
of the series finishing. So it's just feels wrong, but it was weird. It was weird recording or editing the Clone Wars stuff. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I hope more than anything, and this will kind of be the end and we'll move on. Again, don't want to dwell too much on the sadness of it, before we start this what is a really fun discussion. But I think more than anything, Charlotte and I just really hope that Disney and Lucasfilm come out and say something, honestly, especially in support of the actors, especially someone like Amanda Stenberg, who has just received so much racist and misogynistic, so many comments. On all of their social media accounts, as well as the other cast and crew of the Acolyte, but especially Amanda. And that is unacceptable no matter what happens with the show. And it is really time for Disney and Lucasfilm to say something about it. So I think that's ultimately that's the bare minimum of what needs to happen next. So,
Yes.
anyway, we're very sad. Like you said, we will have a Patreon episode to talk a little bit more about it in depth, and you can look out for that on our Patreon feed. The next little bit of housekeeping we have to do is hopefully a bit of an upward swing here, but you may have heard in the past couple of episodes, we have some new bumpers on the beginning and end of our show, and that is because Charlotte and I have Skytalkers has joined a new network called 58 Ember, which we have been talking to the folks at 58 Ember for about 4 months now, kind of deciding if we were going to join the network, and it seemed like a good move for us. So that announcement kind of happened officially a couple of weeks ago now, and we're super excited. This is something Charlotte and I have been thinking about for a couple of years now, actually, and have just been trying to see if we could find a good fit for Skytalkers, and we found it. With 15 Ember, which is really exciting. Nothing is really changing. You will hear ads on our show in the future, but that's about it as far as content changes. But the really exciting thing is that in joining 15 Ember, we have decided to go weekly, kind of officially. So we are weekly now for the foreseeable future, and that is
Yay.
really exciting for us.
Yes, consistency.
Yes.
So I know so many people listening are going to be like, "Oh my God, thank you. I can't
Finally.
handle the 3 weeks off, 1 week on type vibe." So yeah, we hear you, and we're really excited about it. And honestly, it's been really fun too to plan out future episodes
Mhm.
and do them. I don't know. It's been great. I'm really excited about this. We love the 58 Ember Network and the people behind it. So we're really thrilled to join. And we just wanted to like bring you in a little bit on the behind the scenes of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So I think that's it for housekeeping. A little bit opposite sides of the spectrum there. I'm sorry. But that's life, I guess. So let's move into talking about the Star Wars radio drama. Caitlin, let's level set.
Okay.
What do you know about the Star Wars radio dramas?
I really did not know much of anything. They were kind of first introduced to me, honestly, by Blast Points. That is, I think, really when I remember them fully kind of entering my Star Wars consciousness.
Mhm.
And but I didn't listen to any of the radio dramas until this weekend as we prepared to record for today.
Yeah.
And I still haven't been able to listen to all of them. So it's still very new to me, which is really exciting, honestly.
That's the best part about hyperfixating on something
Right?
in the Star Wars universe is unlocking a whole new piece. And this is the funniest thing about when people ask you, how do you have a Star Wars podcast? Like, is there really that much to talk about? And it's so wild when people say that. And it's often I hear that, I feel
Mhm.
like. And
Yeah.
this is a perfect example of, there's a lot of content that we can mine from just this,
Yeah.
this corner of Star Wars
Completely.
media. Anyway, the other thing that I wanted to bring up is, Caitlin, I'm sure you're familiar with the image that I'm going to use as the logo for this episode, but C-3PO in front of a microphone. It's a pretty famous
Yes.
poster.
Uh-huh.
And that's a new chase item for me now. It always has been, but ever since learning about the history and everything, now I really want that. And I think it would be really great for my office area. So,
Maybe we'll find it in Japan.
oh my God, getting a huge poster home from Japan.
We're going to have big suitcases anyway. It's fine.
You're right. Okay, let's move into the meat of the episode. Okay, so part one, we're going to be talking about why the radio drama, the background, the history, and the groundwork of the Star Wars radio dramas.
And in part two, we're going to talk about Star Wars as a radio drama.
And in part three, we're going to talk about the impact and some fun facts about this radio drama series. So without further ado, let's get started.
So who talks first? You talk first? I talk first?
So welcome to part one. And as Caitlin mentioned, I will be kind of guiding us through this. Our audience is probably familiar with what a radio drama is, right? We should start at the very beginning. A radio drama is exactly what it sounds like, a dramatization of something that is played on the radio. These days, that can also be called like an audiobook or an audio drama. An audiobook is probably not the right analogy because a book is different from this is an audio play, right?
Mhm.
This is something that is acted. This is something that has a script versus a novel that is being read, and there's sound effects. It's intense. I think we've, as fans, have become accustomed to the extreme high quality audio quality of the Star Wars audio books that have music, that have amazing narration, different voices. This is different. This is the same high quality, but this is sort of where it all began in the radio drama. So why are the Star Wars radio dramas so important? I think we have to go back to defining and talking about NPR. We have a lot of international listeners. So if you don't know what NPR is, it's the National Public Radio here in the United States. It's not funded by the government. It's a nonprofit, and it's a national syndicator for the thousands of radio stations that we have across the country. It relies on funding from member stations and donations. This is key because you need donations and people watching and listening. I say watching because this also sort of includes side by side the public broadcasting service, which is PBS. You have to have donations and people watching in order to operate independently from the government and continue to exist. So this was started by Lyndon B. Johnson with PBS, like I mentioned, and the first broadcast under the NPR umbrella was in 1971. Let's not forget that George Lucas, we talked about it in our Modesto episode, as much as he wasn't when he was a kid into movies, he was into listening to radio dramas and radio programs on the radio and the storytelling that was in that. So let's put a pin in that and then talk about what makes a good radio drama. So Caitlin, what do you think makes a good radio drama?
As you were talking about kind of, NPR and PBS and something and everything, it really was kind of taking me back. And I was trying to think of myself listening to radio dramas, and it very much unearthed an early memory for me where my mom used to put on, it was this audio drama called Adventures in Odyssey, into
Mhm.
Odyssey. And it was very much like family friendly, heavy Christian values, like that kind of vibe. But it was about these kids like learning Bible stories basically through going into Odyssey. But it was a full radio drama. Like you were saying, it wasn't just an audio book or a script being read. There were sounds and, like you could tell when they were walking places. And I used to love that format. Like we would always listen to it. We were always listening to it on the way home from picking my sister up from dance, like really late at night. And
Mhm.
that's really what I remember. And I can still, as you were talking, I was like, wow, I really hadn't thought about listening to those when I was a kid in such a
Yeah.
long time. And then I was thinking too about recently the Star Wars, and I wouldn't say that recently, but the Star Wars audio drama. There are a couple in the High Republic, which are so
Mhm.
good. Tempest Runner by
Mhm.
Kevin Scott is excellent. And I think to your question, actually answering your question of what makes a good audio drama, I think it's really all of those surrounding pieces, right? It's the music and the sound effects and how well they're integrated. And I think when I was listening to parts of the Star Wars one, which we'll get into, for me, it was the music that really played such a huge role in bringing me in. And I think that's because it's Star Wars. But like Tempest Runner and like the ones from when I was younger, for me it was those sound effects, I think, that really made it good because it differentiated itself and it made itself more lively, I guess, than just someone straight reading.
For sure. I grew up on listening to NPR and a lot of their various programs. My family's a huge fan of A Prairie Home Companion, the Garrison
Mhm.
Keillor show on NPR, and that's like a live recording. It's different than an audio drama, but the point of me bringing that up is that there's on NPR, when it's operating at its high capacity, bringing in different listeners, there's all these different formats of different shows that they have on the radio, just like on television, right? And what I think makes a good radio drama, I agree, it's all those elements that are working together. The most famous one that is sort of the stuff of legends, I'm sure you've heard about it, Caitlin, is the War of the Worlds one, read by Orson Welles.
Mhm.
It kind of is famous based off of the story that grew that isn't as true as everyone seems to think it is, but it did happen and it did cause some scare. So just to back up, there was this audio drama that happened on the radio of the War of the Worlds, and the War of the Worlds drama had a lot of intercuts of news broadcasts talking about how aliens were invading. And this scared a lot of people on the East Coast, and some laws around what you could broadcast on the radio and what constitutes the proper emergency signaling on the radio was put into place due to the War of the Worlds legendary radio drama broadcast. Okay. And this is key. And I bring up the War of the Worlds radio drama because what we're still talking today about this. When I watched the Steven Spielberg version of the War of the Worlds, my parents bring it up. They didn't even listen to it, but they know about it, right?
Mhm.
And when NPR was going through some rough times, they couldn't make enough money from donations. They needed to bring on a new audience. The audience was aging up and they needed to bring in new people. The question for what to do next was, how do we make a splash? And how do we make a quote scandal? And so the president of NPR, Frank Mankiewicz, of the Mankiewicz entertainment family, Frank Mankiewicz's father was Herman Mankiewicz, who wrote Citizen Kane. Frank was like, we have to do something that has to create a scandal. We need something that generates buzz. We can't be known as this old medium, as so many things were changing. And something to also note, NPR was competing with music on the radio. People were listening to music on the radio and not news and audio broadcasting and different programming like theater and quote theater of the mind, like they explore on NPR. So the executive producer of the radio station at USC called KUSC was like, I have an idea. Let's do Star Wars. And this was in 1977 or 1978 that he came up with this idea. And he pitched it to Frank Mankiewicz. And immediately Frank was sold on the concept. He said, quote, Star Wars not only provides us with the opportunity to make use of the latest technology developments to produce radio drama, it also is a major step forward in involving a broad range of American talent on every level. This series should provide a stimulus for drawing new people to public radio, both as listeners and participants. So there's a lot here, by the way, on NPR history that I'm just really summarizing. But if you are interested in more, there's a lot of pages on it in the book that we mentioned that I'll put a link in the show notes about the Star Wars radio drama, Brian Daley and the Serialization That Saved NPR by Maria Jose Tenuto and John Tenuto. They're awesome, and I highly recommend this book. But if you want more NPR history, please read the book and check out the book. But okay, so from here, Star Wars as an idea, we're looking at Star Wars. It's bringing in so much money. It's a cash cow. Everyone loves it. It's changing the way that we think about movies and entertainment, right? We all know this. That's why we're here today.
But the less.
Yeah, literally. The problem for NPR was, how the heck do we get the rights to this? Because the rights and the licensing of Star Wars was also this big juggernaut that is the reason why we're here today too. It's not just the fact that the movie was great and the effects were great and everything. Like, that's one thing, but the licensing is another, and the merchandising and things like that. So how does NPR, which has little to no money for this project, get the rights to Star Wars in order to produce an audio drama? So at the beginning of this fledgling idea, so I mentioned that Richard Toscan, the executive producer of the radio dramas, eventually worked on the broadcast radio stations at USC. Guess who also went to USC? George Lucas. If you're a listener of the show, you know that George Lucas loves USC, and the fact that he his life changed when he was able to go to USC and study film and make all these friends and make movies with his friends. So he was always wanting to give back to USC, and I was always looking for ways to do that. So they scored a meeting, and Caitlin, will you read this quote?
Lucasfilm would grant NPR the rights to the radio version of Star Wars and supply the original sound effects and story for the sum of $1. That act of generosity also had an influence on the separate negotiations that were needed to secure the rights to John Williams' award-winning musical score as performed by the London Symphony Orchestra and owned by 20th Century Fox. Toscan said, quote, Lucasfilm controlled the rights to Star Wars proper, but 20th Century Fox controlled the music. So the audio producer for NPR, Tom Vagelli, went to 20th Century Fox, and how he did this, I don't know, but he ended up getting a deal where we got the rights for $1 per episode. $13, which was 13 times what we had to pay Lucasfilm from the story and sound effects rights. In other words, for the sum total of $14, NPR had the rights to do the Star Wars radio drama featuring the original sound effects and music in the film.
Is that not the craziest thing ever?
Truly wild.
$14, the rights to Star Wars and John Williams' music to use for 13 episodes as a national broadcast. That this would be accessible for free.
It's, I mean, even adjusted for inflation, it's
it doesn't inflation doesn't even matter here. This is like shockingly low. Okay.
I mean, it really does just speak to, I think you had a note here of George liked the concept of seeing the story for free. And this was really making me think about, like, so many people have talked about, you know, people that grew up with the original trilogy, of how this reminder for people like us that had VHS and DVDs that you just couldn't rewatch the stories. Yep. You just couldn't do that. You had the vinyl with the soundtrack, you had the books, you had the merchandise, but you couldn't rewatch the movie the way you can now. And so, you know, it's also business savvy from George's perspective too, to have this in a way where people can relive the story, you know, without having the movies like we do today.
Yeah, it's crazy. So just another quote, Lucas wanted to do something to give back to the school that had given him so much, with the university's radio station KUSC being the primary player and producer of the radio drama. Giving the rights for only $1 could be one such act of gratitude. On Blast Point's podcast, when Blast Points interviewed Maria Jose and John, they said it's the most striking act of philanthropy you could imagine. And just speaking to what you were saying about accessibility, George, the concept of Lucasfilm doing this, quote, is another reason Lucasfilm's generosity was something of the heart, was that the radio drama would be free and accessible in a way movie playing in theaters would not have been.
Mhm.
So as much as Star Wars was being re-released constantly in theaters for people in between the three films, it still like wasn't on people's TV, and it wasn't on VHS, and you couldn't rewatch it. My mom tells the story of just listening to the record over and over again. So this is a different thing. And I think that accessibility is something, and that sort of accessibility, education, and understanding about like awareness around the Star Wars brand is something that George Lucas was always interested in. So just absolutely fascinating to me that all of this happened for $14. Of course, like, yeah, they had to pay the actors and everything. This was the total production was not $14, but the licensing, this is insanely low. And in the book, they talk about how they exited the meeting and it was just like the biggest win of their lives.
I mean, this meeting, was in 1978, right? Or thereabouts. And
1979, 1980, it's all happening.
I'm like, everyone is still waiting to get their mail order toy sets in, like it's such a huge cash cow that George could have charged whatever he wanted for it. We're in literally the heyday of Star Wars. It's still just Star Wars. It's crazy to think about.
Yeah. Okay, so now here's where we're going to talk about Brian Daley. Brian Daley is a hugely important figure in the radio dramas and just in Star Wars history in general. Everyone says there would be no radio drama without Brian Daley. So all that deal aside, they needed a writer. Brian Daley wasn't the original writer that NPR wanted. They originally hired a screenwriter that BBC had always used for their audio dramas and productions. And Lucasfilm's one of Lucasfilm's first employees, her name is Carol Titelman, received the script from the BBC writer and said it wasn't particularly Star Wars and that they didn't get it.
Ouch.
And so so her idea was, I think I have someone who I think would be good, and that would be Brian Daley. So Brian Daley, at this point, in 1979, he started to write the Han Solo trilogy of books, which were the first non-novelization Star Wars books besides Splinter of the Mind's Eye. And this really got him on Lucasfilm's radar because he produced those books and wrote them super fast, and they're really good. And to this day, people love them. They have such a huge fan favorite audience. And there are things, and we'll get to this later, there are things in those Han Solo books that are finding their way into Star Wars even today. And a lot of that is just in adoration of Brian Daley. So this was Carol Titelman's idea. She deserves the credit for bringing in Brian Daley. At this point, who is Carol Titelman? She was the guardian of the world of Star Wars. She had final say on whether to approve scripts or not for being Star Warsy. And the way to think about her, I think, is she was sort of the original story group before we had a story group.
I love
and
this.
So I know they would call her all the time and say, is this okay? Is this good? Because as you'll find out, there's a lot of things that are added into the radio drama that were not in the original films. So that was Carol's final say. Unfortunately, Carol was not present for the last of the radio drama because she moved on, because this was when Lucasfilm, which I found this interesting, no one else is going to find this interesting except for Caitlin maybe. Lucasfilm at this point was based in Los Angeles. And when Lucasfilm made the move to San Rafael, she did not do that move and instead moved to New York with her husband. So yeah.
That is interesting.
Anyway, so back to Brian Daley. So after Carol was like, Brian, can you do this? Brian was so excited. Brian's this huge Star Wars fan. He's loved it. And obviously he's poured so much into the Han Solo trilogy and really knew the world. He takes the drafts that the BBC writer did and rewrites it in 3 months. And there's basically no edits that were needed for this, which is so fascinating to me and just proof that like this guy really knew his stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in order to write the radio drama, you have to get in the mindset of this radio drama is going to be 13 episodes, which is it turns out to be 5 hours. Okay, it's a 5-hour radio drama, which is 3 hours longer than the original Star Wars movies. So what does that mean? That means a lot of extra stuff has to be in it. And because of that, just again, a reminder, Star Wars isn't necessarily dialogue driven, right? It's visually driven. It is very much a visual feast. And so when you make a radio drama, you have to over-inform the audience about what they're listening to and what they're hearing, and allow the imagination to run and kind of walk that line of telling them too much and also telling them a little, right? So a 2-hour movie becomes a 5-hour audio drama. That means a lot of scripts have to be done. Again, no edits on this, wild. So how does he do it? Will you read this quote?
Yes. In addition to the novelization, Splinter of a Mind's Eye, various drafts of movie scripts, and pre-production material, Daley was given something rather unique. During July and August 1977, Titleman had recorded and transcribed interviews with George Lucas as he pretended to be characters he created for Star Wars. As Princess Leia, C-3PO, and Han Solo, Lucas answered questions about origins and experiences. Today, these documents are priceless as they provide a window into what Lucas thought about the characters during the very summer the film was released. Much of what Lucas said about his characters would indeed become part of the sequels, while other ideas would be abandoned. For Daley, these transcripts represented Lucas's thoughts and feelings that would allow him to better understand the backstory of the characters, environments, and history of the Star Wars galaxy.
I want that.
I had no idea about these until I read this. And I just could not stop thinking about George Lucas in a plaid shirt answering a question from the POV of Princess Leia and C-3PO and Han Solo and Luke Skywalker. And I just, what a
This is
gift.
why I included this in this podcast, because I was like, we need this so bad. Just the visual. This is the theater of the mind for me when we talk about radio dramas.
My mind's eye is splintering.
Yeah, literally. I'm like, I need these. And I don't know if they exist out there. Someone let me know. I bet they're locked in a vault somewhere. It's in the archives. We'll never see it. Yeah. But I can't even imagine as a fan, just to bring it back to Brian Daley, receiving these and being like, oh my God, this is gold and this is perfect. So not only did Brian Daley have access to all of that material that we just talked about, will you read this next quote?
Yes. Quote, early during scripting, Daley was also let in on a secret that few knew outside of Lucas, Mark Hamill, director Irvin Kershner, screenwriter Lawrence Kasdan, and a limited group of trusted others. Darth Vader was Luke's father. Quote, I knew going into it what the relationship between Luke and his father, as we find out Darth Vader, would be at the end of Empire, Daley said. He was told because they did not want him in his expansion of Star Wars to deal with Luke's father. I had that explained to me by Carol Titleman at Lucasfilm, but I couldn't go into it too much. I wasn't allowed to give away any of this. It was a great secret to be sprung. I am your father. Really, I think building in some premonition of that on Luke's part, some prescient experience, would have been fun to do in the first series, but you couldn't do that. In addition to Luke's parentage, Daley could not use the character of Jabba the Hutt because of Lucasfilm's plans to use that vile gangster in the third film, which was then in the very early production stages. Instead, Daley created the character Heater to act as a substitution.
Isn't it crazy that he was part of this very small group that knew about Darth Vader being Luke's father? The story, it's a lie. Everything that we know is a lie.
That's what I was going to say. I feel like it's one of those Star Wars stories that I feel like I can quote verbatim of Mark Hamill telling how he knew it was going to be Vader, how they took him aside on the day of filming. You know, David Prowse is going to say Obi-Wan Kenobi, but that's a lie. You know, I know that story, but I did not know this. And I honestly don't know what is more shocking, that Brian Daley was a part of this secret group or that there are interviews out there of Lucas pretending to be Princess Leia.
I'm really dropping some serious bombs on you.
You really are. These are
I think it
two
really
major things I didn't know.
Yes, it really underscores, though, the importance of Brian Daley and the importance that George Lucas and Lucasfilm bestowed upon this project, and how we can really think about it as a companion to the films, because that's how Lucasfilm was looking at it and really trusted the process and trusted Brian Daley. And this is wild. This is wild information to me.
I think, thinking that George kind of set it up for them to have all of the original sound effects and music. To your point, it's like they were taking it seriously. It's a companion. It is Star Wars. It can't veer off the rails. So someone's got to make sure Brian Daley knows where the rails are. So he's got to be brought in.
And no edits. There's one edit.
No edits.
We'll talk about it later. There is one edit. one singular edit, and we'll talk about it later. It's really funny. Okay. One edit in 13 episodes of a 5-hour production is insane. And I think he was bestowed so much knowledge, and he was such a fan. And I'm probably going to cap the discussion of Brian Daley here, but we're going to talk about him a little bit more throughout talking about Star Wars as a radio drama. But Brian Daley works on the next 2 radio dramas as well. So Star Wars, the original radio drama, comes out in 1981, then Empire in 1983, and Return of the Jedi not until 1996, so 13 years later. We'll talk about this more in the next few parts, but this was a long process, and Brian Daley wrote all of them. What's really just the saddest thing ever is that while I mentioned that Return of the Jedi didn't come out until 1996, there was a lot of reasons why that didn't happen, but he really held on hope that that drama would come out, they would be able to work on that. And he, unfortunately, they wrapped the Return of the Jedi recording in Los Angeles, and he died hours later of pancreatic cancer. So it's really devastating. And for Empire and Star Wars, he was present for all of the recording sessions, and Return of the Jedi, he was not because he was so ill. And there's a really sad story about how on the last day of recording, Anthony Daniels recorded a message for Brian Daley telling them how much they love him and everything. It was an uplifting message, and that message was not received because he died hours later. So here's the quote. Daniels wrote his message with the appropriate banter between C-3PO and R2-D2. Master Brian, C-3PO goes on to say, R2 and I want to say it has been a distinct honor and joy to work with you. With our thanks, we send you our very best wishes. Then the droid duo shuffles on, and with 3PO arguing how Hollywood has affected R2 circuits until a fade out. Quote, with the recording of the radio drama Message to Daley completed on late Saturday, February 10th, Vogley called to share the news with Daley. Quote, I got Lucia, Daley, and she said, oh, Tom, he's about to die. And it was always such an important project for him that I always wondered whether he was holding on to hear that the recording was done at the end of Return of the Jedi. So really sad. It's really devastating.
It's really sad. The message as well. That's really heartbreaking.
He worked tirelessly on this and cared about it so much. It's also super interesting, just to bring it back to Brian Daley again. I can't stop talking about this. He was best friends with James Luceno.
Oh.
Like BFF. Okay. And yeah, they went and climbed the Himalayas together, and they wrote books together, not just Star Wars. Like, they didn't write Star Wars books together, but they wrote a lot of things together, and they were BFFs. And I thought that was really nice because I think if you're listening, you know who James Luceno is. He wrote a lot of great Star Wars books and continues to write really great Star Wars books too. He wrote Catalyst, I think, which is the Rogue One prequel. And one of my favorites, Labyrinth of Evil. And I'm just remembering this. The Rise of the Dark Lord of the Sith, which is about Darth Vader. It's really good. Really, really great books. And so I think it's really interesting that they were BFFs, that were encouraging each other. And we love Star Wars BFFs.
We do.
Yes. Okay, so I'm just going to put a cap on Brian Daley there, and we're going to talk more about the radio dramas themselves. So his contribution to this piece of media cannot be overstated. There would be no radio drama without Brian Daley. Mm-hmm. So let's continue on to talk in part 2. Okay, so welcome to part 2, where we're talking about Star Wars as a radio drama. So as I mentioned, Star Wars was in 1981, Empire in 1983, Return of the Jedi in 1996. They were directed by John Madden. He's a film director whose movie Shakespeare in Love won Best Picture. I love Shakespeare in Love, and John Madden has made some great movies. So turns out he also was really a big theater and audio drama director and did all 3 of the Star Wars ones, even into the 90s, which is interesting.
That's when was Shakespeare in Love? Was it?
Yeah, it was similar time period.
Yeah.
He was able to recruit some actors who are big names, especially for Return of the Jedi. So really interesting, and makes me like Shakespeare in Love more. So
there's one thing we love. It's a Star Wars connection.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the dramas themselves. Again, I'm sure we'll probably go deeper someday into the dramas, but let's talk a little bit about them high level. So, as I mentioned, there's not a ton of dialogue in Star Wars, the movies. You might be surprised, but there really isn't. So, a lot had to be fleshed out, and that's where Brian Daley came in. And the first 3 episodes of the original first Star Wars radio drama are bonus material. We get all the stuff that we know about through the deleted scenes that were not released to the public at this point, right? People had heard about them in various ways, but they hadn't seen them, which are Luke Skywalker's life on Tatooine. It starts with him working on his racer. It's talking about the Academy. You hear some external announcements about the Academy and how Luke had to withdraw his application. We meet Cammy, Fixer, and Windy. You know, they call him Wormy. We're familiar with this now, but this is really fleshed out in these 30-minute episodes, and it's very real because Mark Hamill's playing Luke.
Mm-hmm.
We get a lot of actors back. Not a ton. Okay, I should say that. We get Mark Hamill doing the voice of Luke Skywalker, and it's sort of a foray into a reminder that Mark Hamill is a great voice actor and loves to do this. And really, everyone kind of says the same thing at this time period about, wow, Mark is really good at this. And we know that now, but the dramatization that Mark Hamill can bring to a voice is fantastic. And he refers to going back into the Luke Skywalker in A New Hope in this radio drama as sort of a muscle memory and a fun muscle exercise for him, because his voice had matured. And at this point, he was a different person than he was when they were filming this original Star Wars. So going back to it and adding more, I think, was really fun for him.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing when I was listening to these of, wow, I don't remember when Mark started doing voice acting. I don't know if he had any previous voice acting credits to this, but I think we know that in like the 90s is really when that really kicked off for him. Could be wrong about that, but I think it's the 90s is really when he started doing a lot of voice acting. And I wonder how much this really was kind of like a training ground or just like really exploring this medium and thinking, oh, I really like this. And he is really good at it.
I completely agree. There's also some scenes of Leia on Alderaan before we meet Leia in, like we do in the movie. And we meet her father, talk about her father, a lot of tension there. But I think it's just really interesting to remember that when we get the scenes with Luke, that Brian Daley was writing this knowing that Vader is his father, because you can watch Star Wars and not know that George Lucas has made that decision yet.
Right.
but this you can, which is fascinating. So there's just a different way that you can approach this, listening to this, than you get with the movies, which I think is really special. There's a brief narrator in all of them, which is interesting. We don't have a narrator in Star Wars. The closest thing we have is the crawl. And the closest thing after that is that we wouldn't get a narrator until the Clone Wars, when Dave Filoni and George Lucas were like, we can't have a written crawl for a 30-minute television show aimed at kids who we don't want them to struggle to not read it. So that's why there's the voice of war in the Clone Wars. But we have a narrator here that sounds very much like Orson Welles. In fact, they really wanted to get Orson Welles to do it, but that didn't happen. But it is reminiscent to what I was saying about the War of the Worlds, which is the iconic Orson Welles narration. So that's what they really were aiming for. And the narrator pops in every once in a while, and I have to admit, I find it a little odd. It's not my favorite part of the radio drama. You liked it?
I really liked him. Especially when he would come on in like kind of between chapters, basically. Like I've listened to 4 or 5 episodes from Star Wars, like A New Hope edition of the radio drama, and like in the beginning, we've got all this kind of pre-A New Hope stuff, like Charlotte was mentioning, with on Tatooine and Leia on Alderaan with Bail and everything like that. And there's one narration he did where he was like, and Leia is on, he basically sets up the difference between Luke and Leia and how they're about to meet, but they don't know anything about each other yet, and their lives are going to be forever changed. And like, little does Leia know, R2 is headed off to meet Luke Skywalker. And I don't know, I really liked that. I thought it added to kind of the fairy tale storytelling of it. That's so funny you didn't.
It's not that I didn't like it. I just think it's different. And I think it's I think it really speaks more to the radio drama format versus the Star Wars movie format. And I think it's just something I clocked as different. I agree with you. It is very fairy tale-esque, and I do like it in that regard. But yeah, and I also think it is very Orson Welles-like. So it's sort of like, oh, okay, this is different, is sort of the alarm bells that are going off in my head. But that's not
Yeah.
bad.
I thought he also kind of sounded a bit like the trailer of, Somewhere Far, Far Away in the Galaxy. I think to me, it definitely was reminiscent of that tone as well.
A boy, a girl, a universe.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so people love these dramas. It did super well. We'll get into the reception later. But one thing that people, and is often the most talked about thing in the original radio drama, is that the Leia storyline has a lot going for it and a lot of things that are different. So, like I mentioned, we have this beginning, we have this Imperial officer who wants to marry Leia and she doesn't want that. I mean, like, it's kind of crazy. Okay.
It's
and
really wild. I mean, it's basically 3.5 episodes until you get to the beginning of A New Hope, right?
It's I think 3.5 to 4. Yeah.
It's a lot. Yeah, it's a lot.
It's a lot, but it's so interesting as a Star Wars fan to go back and mine this. A lot of this, obviously, now, this is a good time to talk about this, is not canon. But at the time, there was a way for you to think that this was in accordance with continuity and could be canon. So a lot of people before the Disney sale would say that the audio dramas and the films were equal in canon qualifications. And now that's not true, because since the Disney sale, it's really just the films that became the canon, right? But I think there's a way to think about these as like external stories, and the book actually talks about that. The book from the Tenutos, that Star Wars is continuing now today to explore these certain point of view type stories, and I think this is one of them, because I think that the beginning that we're talking about here with the radio drama contradicts Rogue One, unfortunately. So it doesn't really jive with that, but it's okay. It's really interesting, and it's a different look at the character of Leia, especially since Brian Daley used so much external information.
It's a little malleable. We could make it.
Yeah,
make it work.
exactly.
The secret dinner party with the Imperial officer to ask for Leia's hand in marriage. Maybe not as malleable, but entertaining nonetheless.
Absolutely. Something that is interesting is there's a torture scene. So in A New Hope, Leia gets like a needle injection. We see the droid coming at her, and then the door shuts and we hear the fact that like a torture is happening for Princess Leia, right? In episode 8 of the radio drama, there's a torture scene of Leia that is pretty gruesome and graphic. And it was the fact of the matter is that this actually came from one of the earlier drafts of Star Wars. Caitlin, could you read these quotes?
Yeah, so this is about the early draft of Star Wars. In the August 1st, 1975 version of the script, The Star Wars, from the Adventures of the Starkiller, George Lucas had scripted the rescue of Princess Leia differently than how it was filmed. It is Han and Chewbacca in this version who break Leia out of her cell. They were shocked by Leia's appearance, bloodied with yellow eyes and disfigured. Leia was hanging upside down. Chewbacca would carry her through the new scenes of the film until she recovered. Carrie Fisher spoke about this never-filmed moment to Rolling Stone in 1980. I was just hanging upside down with yellowed eyes, like in The Exorcist. They should have just gotten Linda Blair for it. Some form of radar torture was done to me, and I was in a beam, bruised and beaten up, suspended in midair. The reason it was cut from the film was because I was unconscious, and the Wookiee would have had to carry me for like the next 15 minutes. Daley knew that it would not be possible to recreate that moment on radio. So instead, he focused on the equally distressing psychological aspects of the torture Leia endured. Radio drama audiences would learn that the torture droid that accompanies Vader in the film gives Leia a mind control drug that was physically painful and mentally damaging, creating hallucinations and confusion that Vader uses to intimidate Leia. Daley said of the scene, "While the motion picture doesn't depict the encounter, I took it as a chance to show Vader and Leia clashing will to will. It was a nightmarish confrontation, and it got us our one and only letter of complaint complaint. But since the Star Wars radio drama drew a lot of main, I don't think that response was too damning.
So, Caitlin, you've listened to the episode. What did you think about it?
It's a lot. It's a lot. You know, you had told me to make sure that I listened to that episode as I was going through, and yeah, it's not even that it is bad. It's a lot, but it is long too. The
Yeah.
scene is quite long, I think. So it's just kind of going on and on. Like, you hear Vader give Leia gets the shot, and they start this back and forth about, you know, is she going to tell where the base is and all of this. But then he starts describing to her the ways that she's dying. It's like in her mind, right? And he tries to trick her that he's actually he starts to trick her that he's in the rebellion with the mind control trick. Like, I'm in the rebellion. You want to tell me where it is. Your father wants you to tell me where he goes into this whole thing. And Leia is like, no. But you can hear her getting progressively weaker. And then when that tactic isn't working, that's when Vader starts describing the ways that she's dying. And he talks about her body being on fire and her skin burning, and she's close to death. It really goes on for a while. And I think that's kind of the alarming part of it, is just how many minutes it kept going on.
Yeah. So I think the goal for Brian Daley here was, like he said, to show Vader and Leia clashing will to will, but it is pretty dark. And I think it's one of these things that, like everyone mentions, this is often talked about as like, oh my God, that's crazy that they did that in the radio drama. And it is.
Mhm.
I think it is a clear exploration of something that would never be in the films too.
Yeah.
Just based off of, like Carrie said, that she would be unconscious for part of it.
I will say it's interesting, the concept of when Vader is pretending to be her father, pretending to be Bail, and the way that he's kind of talking
Yes.
about what her father would want, but he's in that position, you know, pretending. I think, you know, listening to that now, it's really interesting to think about, of course, because he is Leia's father. I thought that was a really fascinating component of this. And you know, there's now in canon, we have a lot of stories about, you know, Bloodline as kind of the example. I think the novel Bloodline, of how Leia feels about Vader and Anakin, and the ways that she's kind of struggled with the truth of who he was compared to Luke. And this scene, I think, would really kind of it would almost be interesting to have her reflect on this scene or something like this, not the torture itself, but like Vader pretending to be her father in this hallucination. I don't know. It was just, it's
I think that's valuable in a way.
Yeah,
because
for her character.
Because I think Brian Daley at this point did not know about Leia. He knew about Vader and Luke, but not about Leia and Vader, right? But it's sort of this unintended consequence, or like a fun thing to go back and think about. But fun is probably not the right word, but at the same time, like, I think when Leia wrestles with her feelings about Anakin Skywalker, there's so many strikes against Vader for Leia, and this is one of them. And this feels really deep, right?
Yeah.
The number one strike being the destruction of Alderaan, but this was extremely personal and very real. And getting this, I think, really helps understand how, of course, Leia is harder to accept Anakin Skywalker's redemption than Luke. Luke didn't experience this. Luke didn't experience the destruction of his homeworld at Vader's hand, et cetera, right? So I think this edition, while I don't think Brian Daley knew that when he was writing it, is an interesting addition to canon, I guess.
Yeah. I'll also say I really liked Leia's voice actress.
Yes, Anne Sachs. She's awesome.
I think sometimes voice actresses for Leia can be kind of hit or miss for me. And while I don't think this is a direct impression of Carrie Fisher as Leia, I still bought it as Leia in a weird way. And I thought that Anne Sachs did a really good job as her.
I completely agree. I think Anne Sachs did a great job. And I like her. You know how Carrie Fisher always talks about the weird little English accent that she had in A New Hope? Anne Sachs does that too, and it works. In terms of the torture scene in episode 8 of the original Star Wars audio drama, Anne Sachs' son was traumatized by this scene as a kid, and it didn't come out until later in this interview with Anne Sachs that was the case. Like, she didn't know that until later in her son's life, which is like kind of sad.
She does.
It's dark.
And it's also the same episode where obviously Alderaan is destroyed as well, and that is elongated as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very dark kind of 20 minutes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It is. Okay, so we'll talk about impact later, but the Star Wars original audio drama is fantastic. It is a great thing to listen to. They did such an amazing job, and the voice acting is amazing. The sound editing work is incredible. The music is just fantastic, and I feel like we're so lucky to have these, and they exist now on archive.org. I'll link them. You can go listen to them now. And some people own like the CDs and stuff like that. But the question after the original Star Wars one came out really was, are we going to make Empire? If this is successful, like, what's next? Because the first one came out in 1981. Empire Strikes Back was already out. So when they finally greenlit the Empire Strikes Back one, they only had 10 days to do the recordings. The production shifted to New York City from Los Angeles, and that made everything easier. Everyone always talks about how fantastic the Empire Strikes Back audio drama recording was, and they even got Billy D. Williams to come back and do Lando Calrissian, and Mark Hamill was back. Anthony Daniels was back. Yeah, it was a great time, and they recorded it in New York City in 10 days. It was easier for everyone. But the thing is, and so when that came out, it was another success. But it also came out concurrently with some troubles with NPR, which, like I said, you can dive into. But because of that, I think there was a question about whether or not they would do Return of the Jedi. It was a whole other piece, right? Return of the Jedi after Empire Strikes Back, they were struggling with funding for the project. Some of those licensing deals and things like that were expiring and changing. So that $14 from that original, this is not the case when it comes to Return of the Jedi. And because of that, things were put on hold for a really long time. Like I mentioned, Return of the Jedi doesn't come out until 1996. And due to funding issues, they put a pause on Return of the Jedi. And so the only ones out are Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back. And Brian Daley really held out hope that they would make it again. And James Luceno and him would cross their fingers and really hope that it would come out again. And then they would be able to do it again. So what happens 13 years later is that there's a rise of audiobooks and books on tape and things that we were talking about in the beginning of this podcast. And because of this, there was a lot of marketing and merchandising that was happening with these audio dramas. You could put them on a CD and sell them. But the weird thing about it is there was no Return of the Jedi. So they couldn't market it as a complete... Yeah, they couldn't market it as a whole trilogy. So what do? You kind of re-explore doing a Return of the Jedi again. So finally, they're able to do it. And they got the green light in order to do it. And they wanted to finish the trilogy. So instead of recording in New York City, they went back to Los Angeles. And the casting changed a bit too with this one since so much time has passed. They did not bring back Mark Hamill because of scheduling issues. And because it moved to Los Angeles instead of New York, Brian Daley's from New Jersey. This was another reason why Brian Daley, of course, he was really ill, but it was all the way in California. So as we mentioned, the extremely tragic passing of Brian Daley at the end of the recording sessions, he really did hold off until they could finish the trilogy. And that was a huge wish of his. I love the last line of the Return of the Jedi radio drama. And it's from Luke Skywalker. And Luke Skywalker says, "Their fire is back in the universe. Let it burn high and bright to be seen by friend and foe. The Jedi have returned."
It's very good.
I know, isn't it so good?
It's really good.
I know, it's such a good line. We're so blessed that we have all three of these, and it's very, I don't know, it's very cool. So they're able to market it and publish it and explore this new world of audiobooks and books on tape and books on CD. So eventually,
it's just another great classically Star Wars to have Return of the Jedi 1 come out 13 years later. This franchise, I swear to God.
I know. The funny thing also is Brian Daley's lucky number, before Taylor Swift claimed it as her lucky number, Brian Daley's lucky number was 13. There are 13 episodes in the original first Star Wars audio drama, and it was 13 years between Empire and Return of the Jedi. And that was recognized. No, it's really cute.
Yeah.
So I know. It's lucky number 13. So let's move on to talking about the impact and fun facts of the radio dramas.
Listen, big deal. You got another problem. Women always figure out the truth. Always.
So welcome to part 3. We're talking about the impact and fun facts around the radio dramas. So let's start with some of the reviews that came out from the original radio drama. So this review is from the Los Angeles Times. Star Wars has not only taken radio drama one step beyond in terms of sound quality, but also has bridged the gap between the deceptively simple theater of the mind wonderment of radio's past with the technological wizardry of its present. The result is a fun, spine-tingling, mind-bending piece of escapist entertainment that doesn't miss the visuals one bit. So the big question is, sure, we love the radio dramas today, but what did they move the needle? Did they do anything that helped NPR, that helped the radio drama? I think obviously I kind of spoiled it by saying that they made 2 more, but yes, it did. So, Caitlin, will you read this next quote?
Yes. The Star Wars radio dramas led to an increase of 40% more listeners for NPR that year than the year before, with a 135% increase in drama programming specifically. There were increases in ratings among all demographic groups. 11% of the 750,000 listeners were 12 to 17 years old, an increase of 4 times the norm. Usually, NPR generated 35% of its audience from the 25 to 39 age group. With Star Wars, 50% of those listening were that age. 10,000 letters and 50,000 phone calls were received. A problem for NPR, albeit a great problem to have, because they had the capacity to only handle a fifth of that number.
Any thoughts about that?
50,000 phone calls.
I know.
And I love this little tidbit that 50% of those listening were older because, you know, we love to say that Star Wars is for young people, and it is, obviously. But George has also said for young people at heart, famously. So I like that there's this kind of call out to an older age group that's listening.
Yeah, I agree. So the fact is, this was a success. So all the struggles in the beginning about whether or not they were going to do it, whether or not it made sense to make the most visual movie into the non-visual medium. This is what the book has to say about it. Quote, "The uncertainties and questions that had plagued the production since its inception had been answered. Star Wars was a creative scandal that caught the imagination of the press. It was a rating success that NPR was able to utilize in salvation of its budget and relevance. It would run and rerun for years on NPR." And just the word scandal there, I just want to remind you, they were after a scandal. They were after doing something different because they were chasing or trying to replicate or trying to figure out a way to generate buzz that would be somehow similar to that original War of the Worlds broadcast. That obviously had a lot of issues, but what was successful about it? It created a scandal that we're still talking about today. So what are we still talking about today? Star Wars. What are we talking about right now? The radio dramas. Was it successful? Yes. They created this product that has stood the test of time and regenerated their audience. It's really fascinating.
I love calling Star Wars a creative scandal. I think that's such a deft way to describe it because it was even its inception and creation is a creative scandal. The way that George was just like, yeah, you know, F it, I'm going to do it myself after Star Wars with like as little studio backing as he could possibly manage. The way he set it all up like that, it's a creative scandal. Putting Skywalker Ranch up in San Francisco, north of San Francisco, and not in LA, I think is a creative scandal. I don't know. It feels like a really cool way to describe Star Wars.
I agree. Here's another quote. Quote, "The reverb of the creative scandal that was the Star Wars radio drama continued in its immediate wake and to this day. Toscan reflected, quote, When that first series started airing, we were all caught up in the euphoria, what was really unimaginable success, thinking we were ushering in a new age of radio drama in America. What none of us realized then was that for it to become a mass entertainment media again, radio drama had to be freed from the radio. And this was the onset of why Return of the Jedi was greenlit, because enter audiobooks, cassettes in the 90s that allowed for the production of Return of the Jedi. And so this laid the groundwork. While this was a success in 1981, it was, again, a different kind of success in 1996. And I just find that fascinating. Again, a creative scandal. We love the creative scandal.
I feel a new phrase coming into Skytalkers.
Absolutely.
I feel that energy.
We've arrived
in the microphone right now.
Yeah. Okay. So the radio dramas were a success, are a success, and we're still talking about them today. So let's go into the fun facts.
I love fun facts.
Yes. So let's start off with the cast. I mentioned that Mark Hamill and Anthony Daniels are back, but here's some interesting ones. John Lithgow plays Yoda, which is crazy. Ed Begley Jr. plays Boba Fett, and Brock Peters, who played Tom Robinson in To Kill a Mockingbird, played Vader. They also scored, like I mentioned, Billy D. Williams for Empire, and Anthony Daniels is the only original Star Wars actor to be in all three.
That tracks.
Yeah, it does track. And apparently in his biography, which I have not read, he talks a little bit about how much he enjoyed this process.
I think you can tell that it's fun, especially, again, I've only listened to part of the first part of A New Hope, but there's so much more C-3PO and R2-D2 banter as they're like, there's the scene where Leia is doing the holographic recording, help us Obi-Wan Kenobi. You can hear 3PO in the background going, R2, where are you? Like, he's so annoyed he can't find R2. It's really quite funny.
Speaking of fun facts about 3PO, an interesting challenge came up with C-3PO during the recording process. So just a reminder, right now we're recording this podcast with a digital interface where I will edit this digitally with all the effects that I can add, and I can do anything I want to this podcast edit, okay? But this was different in 1981. We were still like figuring out new technology and like ways to edit and things like that, right? Of course, we've been editing for years, but it was a little bit of a struggle given the fact that 3PO, particularly, everyone did, but particularly most of his lines were redubbed in post. Actually, all of his lines were redubbed in post, right? So a good deal of editing is happening with 3PO's edits and for the films. But for the radio drama, C-3PO can't breathe. He doesn't breathe. He's a droid who doesn't breathe. But like right now, when you're listening to this podcast, we're humans who are talking into a microphone. And guess what? We breathe. I just breathed just then. So
and Anthony Daniels is also human. So
yes, true. Contrary to popular belief.
Yeah. Also breathing.
Also breathing. So a lot of work had to be done to remove his breath. And I think it's really interesting. And also he shared the space with the actor who played Darth Vader. So if you think about it, one character you have to remove the breath and the other character you have to add the breath. There's just like a lot of breath challenges happening.
A lot of breath work. I will say Vader's breathing is, I've found it a little distracting at times. Mm-hmm. I think it's pretty loud in the mix. And it's always there.
Are you just aware of it because you're zeroed in on it? When in the movie, are we just used to it? Because sometimes I'm like, oh, damn, he's really breathing. He's really going.
I couldn't tell you. All I can tell you is when I was listening, I kept thinking, could they turn down his breath modulator a little bit?
Yeah, totally. It's so funny. Just keep speaking off the cuff about using Ben Burtt's sound effects. They were able to have access to a lot of Ben Burtt's sound effects, and Ben Burt worked with them and everything. And then they had to record a lot of other ones too. So they had a different audio designer for the radio dramas that worked from USC. And Ben Burt did work on it. I just want to be clear about that. But there was a lot of new things that had to be done that were different than the movies. And I just have to wonder, like you saying, can you just turn it down? Like, I wonder how hard that would be. I think it would be really hard because I don't know anything about how it was. All I know is my rudimentary setup for podcast editing. But I feel like it's just kind of ironic about all the chatter about breath, breathing.
It is.
Another interesting thing, potentially only to me, is that they promoted the Empire Strikes Back radio drama with a New York Times columnist Craig Claiborne recipe of Yoda's stew. I posted this on our Instagram story the other day, and I think it's interesting because they made this recipe for, as much as I can tell, for the promotion for The Empire Strikes Back. And like I mentioned, they recorded The Empire Strikes Back radio drama in New York City, and they did their premiere at the Hayden Planetarium here in New York City. The first Star Wars radio drama's premiere was actually at the Griffith Observatory underneath the stars in the planetarium, which I think sounds really cool. And they mimicked that for the Hayden Planetarium here in New York City as well. And so because of that celebration, they worked with the New York Times recipe contributor to make this Yoda stew recipe, which sounds really good. I think
I
I'm
want
going
to
to
make
post
it.
I think I do too. I think
we
I'm
got
going to post it in feed. And so maybe we should all make it. But one thing I think is interesting is when I saw this on Instagram before I did my research for this radio drama, is that this stew was used to promote eventually Return of the Jedi, the movie. So was this stew made for the radio drama? Or I think it was, but they recycled it.
They liked it.
They liked it. They liked this concept and the New York Times of it all. So I'm going to post about it. I just think it's kind of fun.
I think we got to make it. Soup season, stew season.
Yeah.
It's coming up.
Yoda stew season.
Yoda stew season. We're here.
I'm shifting into Yoda soup mode.
I'm shifting into Dagobah mode.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Only soup,
Okay.
no outdoors, just cozy.
Yeah, it's crazy. Okay, so the next part of fun facts, I just think this is really funny. So I mentioned a while ago that there were limited edits to the script, right? Like limited, basically none. So Caitlin, will you read this quote?
This is from the producer at USC, Richard Toscan again. He says, Brian had a line that I missed when editing the scripts where Han Solo says in response to something when they're on the Millennium Falcon, I just drive the bus. It was funny, a good joke. They recorded the line and I thought, wait a minute. I went out and called Carol Titleman and said, can Solo say this? A minute. And then she said, no, not part of our world. I told him the line had to go and we'd have to redo the scene. John liked it, thought it was really funny. Brian was heartbroken, but the change had to be made.
Okay, I bring this up because I think this is really funny. People love the story. But we just recently got a trailer for the new Star Wars series Skeleton Crew, and everyone was abuzz about what? A Star Wars bus.
A school bus.
Is this a Brian Daley reference?
I don't think so.
It could be.
It could be. It would be really nice if it was. And I hope he gets to watch Star Wars Skeleton Crew up in heaven and sees the bus and knows that justice has been served for him and I just drive the bus line, because it is really funny and I can totally see Han Solo saying that.
Yeah, it's a great line. The reason I bring that up also is it's not insane to think there would be a Brian Daley tribute, because so many things that Brian Daley wrote, there's a whole list in this book. I can't even go through it. It's like 4 pages of all the different Easter eggs from that it is in present day Star Wars, from both his Han Solo books and these radio dramas. It's crazy. So in The Mandalorian, in Solo, it's literally everywhere. So I don't think this is really out of turn, to be honest.
So we're just going to say the bus is a tribute to Brian Daley.
I want to say the bus is a tribute to Brian Daley.
I think we should do that then.
Okay, I'm saying it right now.
Creative
it's
scandal.
August 25th. This is the creative scandal.
We're giving the bus to Brian Daley.
Yeah. So that's it for really fun facts here. I just think the audio dramas are filled with fun things, and this will not be the last time that we talk about them. I also want to mention that, and I think we sort of already mentioned this, but there's a section of Maria and John's book that talks about how important the radio drama is, the Star Wars radio drama is, and should be when we're talking about podcasting. And there's a world in which maybe we wouldn't be Star Wars podcasting if there wasn't a Star Wars radio drama and the impact of audio storytelling. Because what we're doing right now is audio storytelling. It's the same thing that Brian Daley was doing. It was the same thing that John Madden was doing when he was directing these brilliant radio dramas. So we're part of this storied history with Star Wars somehow. And I just think it's really cool. And it deserves our recognition, because personally, as much as people had been like, I asked Caitlin like what her familiarity was with it. People have been throwing around for so long how great these radio dramas are. Like we've heard about it for years when people talk about like, oh, we love this. Star Wars should be doing more audio dramas, and it's like, why? Because there's a storied history, and it's like, okay. And I swear I've listened, but it just didn't hit like I said until now. And I feel like they deserve their flowers. And obviously it revitalized NPR, which is still around today and hugely important into the media fabric of the USA. Also, I should mention that I didn't mention is that the Star Wars radio dramas were also broadcast on the BBC as well, at a later date, but super successful over there as well. But the purpose really was to Americanize the Star Wars brand for their media. But I think it's just, I just wanted to like take a moment to realize that like we're part of this audio Star Wars history somehow. Somehow.
I think it's really fascinating to kind of learn more about how these were developed and just the audio format being such a prevalent part of Star Wars history. And like you said, that podcasting is a continuation of that in a different format, which makes sense because podcasts obviously weren't around in 1978 in the 1980s, like in the way that they are now. So everything, has its time. And I think we should have more, like the audio dramas I mentioned, the Star Wars ones that we do have are so great. So there should be more. And I think it would be great to have these live somewhere where they are more accessible, not on like an internet archive site like you're going to have in our show notes, but can they be re-aired on NPR? Can they be on StarWars.com for people to go and listen to?
Yes.
I think that would be great. And why not?
Well, that would speak to the accessibility piece that George was super interested in.
Yeah, the whole origin story of it from the first place.
Mhm.
And we were talking earlier, and I was saying I almost wish we had recorded this later because I am driving tomorrow about 6 hours. And I was like, I'm going to be listening to the rest of the drama in the car. So I almost wish we had been able to record after I'd listened to the full thing. And how fun would it be to just pop it on to StarWars.com and have all three of them available to listen to whenever you wanted.
Let's do it. Who do we talk to?
I don't know. I really don't know, but please. I think it would be so fun. And just another great kind of new entry point for people into Star Wars.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they're really neat and so well done. And yeah, I hope that you found it interesting if you're listening. And I can't recommend the Star Wars radio dramas, Brian Daley and this serialization that saved NPR, the book by Maria Jose Tenuto and John Tenuto, more. If you're interested, like I mentioned, they go into a lot more about the NPR stuff than I can. And there's so many fun stories and stuff that I just wanted to make sure that like we didn't regurgitate that, because I think it's so, I want you to read the book if you're listening. So please read the book. And also I'll link a link to the book, and then also I'll link a link to Blast Point's interview with Maria Jose and John that was from 2019 that I thought was great. And yeah, I just feel like I'm just so thrilled that we're talking about this now. And like you said, you wish that we recorded this later, but we'll probably talk about the dramas as they are someday in the future. And I do know that you can buy the scripts from the dramas, which I think is really cool. And I would love to buy that. And I think that's my next project to buy. So maybe someday Caitlin on the podcast will talk about the scripts. I think that would be really fun. Yeah. So if you haven't listened, I hope that you go listen now, just like Caitlin, and we'll
join me.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Charlotte. This was such a fun dive into a corner of the Star Wars galaxy that I knew about but wasn't super familiar with. So thank you for guiding us through this episode. It was really fun.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah. Well, I think that is going to wrap it up for us this week. If you want to tell us about your experience with the radio dramas, or if they're completely brand new to you, we would love to know. You can find us on Twitter/X at SkyTalkersPod, or our personal handles. Charlotte's is at Crarity and mine is at Caitlin Plusher. We also have our website, skytalkers.com, our Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, email. Definitely head over to Instagram if you want the Yoda stew recipe as we head into stew season, Dagobah season. That'll be on our Instagram. And if you have a couple seconds and would like to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, we would really appreciate it. And if you are interested in other ways to support us, you can head on over to our Patreon and check out our reward tiers there.
I want to say a huge thank you to these patrons: Greg, Todd, Sindel, Starbores, Lucy, Jenny, Adam, David, Chris, Draconius Rex, GMO, Lindsay, Olivia, Simon, Triumphant Ewok, Kylie, Corey, Allie, Emily, Sophia, Danyan, Nanami, Tadashi, Ben, and Emily. Thank you so much for supporting us.
Yes, thank you guys so much. And until next time, may the force be with you.
May the force be with you.
This has been a 58 Ember production. For more shows, please visit the 58 Ember channel, 58ember.com, or find us at 58 Ember Media on socials.